Hey everyone, my name is Andrea and I'm product specialist here at ProdPad. And with me today is Janna Bastow, our CEO and co-founder. And today we're going to be talking about timelines and how to get off them. Now, before we get started, just to let you know, we are going to be taking questions at the end, so you can ask them on the Q&A or chat options on your Zoom panel. So be sure to stick around for that. With that said, Janna, go ahead.
Great, thanks so much for the intro and welcome everybody. Really glad to be chatting to you all about this, frankly, quite a contentious subject. It's something that comes up time and time again because we talk about road mapping and we talk about the difference between timeline roadmaps and lean roadmaps. And the question comes up time and time again about, what to say to your boss when they ask for a timeline. And so we have decided to tackle that tricky topic today, and I'm excited to do so. Just to start off, quick hello from me. My name is Janna Bastow, and I am the co-founder of ProdPad. I'm a product manager at heart, so feel free to come say hello and find me on Twitter at Simply Bastow or connect with me on LinkedIn. I'd love to chat with you all. You also might know me as one of the founders of Mind the Product, which is a really big community for product managers. We put out a lot of content for product people, and I've actually done a write-up of this exact topic. So that's something that we can probably send around after this as well, if you wanted to share this with your colleagues as well. As I mentioned, I'm also co-founder and CEO of ProdPad, which is software for product managers. And it was something that originally I built because I needed tools to help me do my own job, and they simply didn't exist at that point in time. Today, ProdPad is used by literally thousands of product people around the world and helps product managers do product management in a much more lean fashion. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how that works, but more about why I talk about ditching your timeline roadmap. And some of you might know about the way that I talk about timeline roadmaps and why they don't work for business. So just as a quick review, this is a timeline roadmap. And if you look at this format makes you look great today. Your board and your bosses certainly love when you can give them this level of certainty, but it's often setting teams up for failure. See, because if you deconstruct this format of roadmap, you basically get a chart that maps out time versus things to do. And you have time on this x-axis that creates this timeline. And at first, it seems pretty easy and intuitive to use, especially in the short term. But the further out you plan and the more you put on there, the harder it becomes to manage. And because that timeline sits at the top, always marching forward, no matter what you put on the roadmap, everything on there always includes a due date and some sort of time estimate, and just by the very format of the roadmap itself. And as a result, you end up with a big pile of features and a big pile of deadlines, all based on this big pile of assumptions. So one assumption you're making with this format is that you know exactly how long each of these features is going to take. And that might be easy for the stuff that you've broken down into more detail, like in the short term, where the developers have given you good estimates. But the further down the list you go, the less clarity you've actually got. And you're also assuming that nothing else is going to come in and disrupt that timeline. No new changes in the market, no new competitors, no fresh ideas coming from customers, no real need for iteration. And you're also assuming that each of these features is going to work as soon as it's launched. So if you've put 3 weeks in there to build some new checkout page, then at the end of those 3 weeks, then you're expecting it to convert exactly as expected, and you're free to move on to the next thing. But that never happens. That's a big assumption that you're making. And so by explicitly adding these features to the timeline, you're assuming that each of these features actually deserves to exist, that they form part of the strategy and therefore should be codified. And at the end of the day, you're making one big, dangerous assumption, and that is that nothing is going to change. And so what could possibly go wrong? Well, you're ending up with these made-up release dates that are forcing your developers on stressful marches to launch on time, often giving your sales and customers some expectations that you can't meet, often while making you miss opportunities in the market and while downright building the wrong things, which leads to you having a sad and stressed out team of product managers and everyone else around them. Now, when I talk to individuals about this, they get it. but somehow organizations as a whole don't. And for some reason, it seems to be the larger the organization, the more that they struggle with this concept. And I like to think about organizations on this continuum. Like what kind of organization are you? Are you a super nimble and lean company? You were formed last week. You can pivot on the dot if you find something else that might be a better problem to solve. Or are you a slow and risk-averse company, possibly in a regulated space that can't move? Even if you do spot some new opportunities or something like that on the horizon. Most companies sit somewhere along this continuum, and most companies are trying to find their way back towards that more nimble and lean, while still taking advantage of the market opportunities that they get when they're capitalizing on the market. But what's going on in these companies? Like, why are they addicted to these timelines? Because this will give you some insight as to how to talk to your boss to get off those timelines. Well, the larger the company is, particularly if you're talking about publicly traded companies. I mean, a publicly traded company has this fiduciary duty to increase their shareholder value. That's what they're worried about at the board level. And really, this is what they're looking for. They're looking for this nice and steady quarter-on-quarter growth. CEOs are incentivized to show this. And if they don't, they're turfed. And so the management style lends themselves to these slow improvements, either driving costs down or revenues up, but rarely giving any opportunity to invest in any proper future growth. And predictability is a huge factor in these companies. The upward growth doesn't even have to be that much. It can even be in the sub 1% per year, so long as the outcomes match the forecasts. Unpredictability spooks investors. It spooks anybody who is invested in those stocks or is looking to reinvest into the company itself, which in turn can have a bigger knock-on effect than anything operational happening within the company. And so if you're looking to get predictability, it actually makes a lot of sense to break the business up into smaller, more manageable chunks. But what this actually leaves you with is silos. And so what you end up with are these different silos. You've got sales silo, a marketing silo, an R&D or product silo, an HR silo, different areas of the business that have been broken up. And what basically happens at this point in time is you end up with some of these being considered as profit centers and some of them being considered as cost centers. This is what's happening inside these companies. Now, sales and marketing, they're easy to identify as profit centers, as in if you invest more money in your sales department or your marketing department, if they're doing a good job, then theoretically you'll get some more revenue back out of them. HR is a cost center. It's an operational cost. Every business has to have some form of it. It costs money to recruit and keep talent. But it doesn't make you money usually. And what do you think they think of product and development and R&D and innovation? More often than not, that is considered a cost center in these companies. And so companies are looking to squeeze just a little bit more revenue out of sales and marketing and push down costs in support, tech, operations, HR. And what that actually leads to is creating vanity metrics per division. Some of these vanity metrics in sales and marketing might lead to misincentivized sales leads, like collecting leads or things like that. But in R&D and product and things like that, you actually might recognize things like this. For example, do you count your user stories up and see how many you can deliver in one sprint and see if you can beat that the next sprint? Do you have a burn down chart and do you measure velocity? These are all metrics that are measured in order to control the costs and understand the costs of a product development cost center division, in order to control those costs, in order to make sure that you've got a slow, steady growth, controllable growth, predictable growth of the company itself. And what actually ends up happening is that the company starts focusing less and less on the outcome and focuses on the output, measuring things like story points and burn down charts and velocity and things like that, rather than focusing on whether they're solving real problems across the business. And so what tends to happen is that companies look at roadmaps like this and they just assume that it's a bunch of story points, a bunch of features that need to be delivered. And if they want to deliver on it, they simply need to add more developers to it, or wait until the allotted amount time passes and the roadmap will in fact be delivered. And the thing is that this doesn't work. And even when it does work, you end up with, at the end of the day, simply put, a bunch of features. And everyone knows that a bunch of features does not necessarily make a good product. So that all said, we can see some of the underlying problems that are happening with companies and why they're sometimes misincentivized to look at timeline roadmaps and delivery focused and vanity metrics per division and that sort of thing. So I want to talk about some of the big questions that people come up with when faced with the idea of stepping away from a timeline roadmap. Now, this is actually one that I come up with more and more rarely nowadays, but it is one that I wanted to just start with because occasionally you get the occasional product manager who says that my roadmap is fine. Like, why do I need to ditch my timelines? And to this one, I would say that the biggest reason that people stick with the timeline roadmap is usually due to other stakeholders, like their boss or customers. But some people liked their timeline roadmap the way that it is, and they don't really see the need for change. But to be honest, it's a really bold assumption to say that you know exactly what you need to build, especially months in advance, right? To stand at the beginning of 2019 and say that you know exactly what needs to be built and when it's going to be out. The best product people aren't the ones who make the assumptions about the future and drive towards them. Instead, the best product managers are the ones who know to surround themselves with experts and to ask the best questions. They know that markets and constraints change and that the best way to take advantage of opportunities is to remain lean with a flexible roadmap. And so a timeline roadmap just doesn't give room for discovery and iteration. And at the end of the day, makes the product person look bad when the delivery fails or the wrong product is built. So for anybody who's sticking with that roadmap just because it sort of looks good and makes it look good, I recommend taking a step back and thinking about whether you're making big, bold assumptions that can actually be questioned, and that you actually might be better off taking a step back and leaving a bigger, blanker roadmap and deciding what kind of things are going to happen based on your understanding of the market and the questions that you're asking. Now, one big question that I get is, what about showing dates that are absolutely necessary? Because some folks rightly point out that there are times when delivery dates really are necessary to hit. How is that possible when you don't have a timeline roadmap? Which is absolutely fair. But what I want to say to that is that just because you don't have a timeline on your roadmap doesn't mean you can't ever use your roadmap to communicate important dates or milestones. Now, we all want to be hyper lean and build the right things at the pace required with no looming deadlines to cause stress and tech debt. But we don't live in that world, right? We don't live in a perfectly nimble and lean world with no constraints. Sometimes we do have externally driven, strategically important, unavoidable deadlines. Like any of you who are dealing with the EU, for example, are familiar with GDPR. In the run-up to that, I saw many roadmaps, and mostly lean roadmaps with cards on them with hard specified dates leading up to it. GDPR was a regulatory thing. There was no getting around it. And if you didn't have something due by then, finished by then you ran the risk of being fined for it. And therefore, your roadmap had to communicate that date. You had to have something done by then. It was important to communicate that to your team. And that's the key, is that just because one item on your roadmap has a date doesn't mean you have to give everything a due date. A timeline on your product roadmap basically does this. And this is why you need to ditch that timeline. Your roadmap is meant to be a human readable document that communicates your product strategy. So if a key date is part of that strategy, write it down. But the fewer key dates that you commit to, the faster, more flexible that you can be. So just to see an example of that, here is a timeline roadmap. Everything on this, just because of this format of it, has a due date associated with it. You've got a bunch of due dates just stacked up one after the other. Now, only a few of these things might be regulatory or strategically important or truly committed dates that the company can't work around, but the fact that the roadmap exists in this format means that everything has been given this date, which is the underlying problem. On a lean roadmap, showing the time horizons of now, next, later, you'll see that the timeline doesn't exist at the top, but there are certain cards within there that actually do represent time-driven items. So there are half a dozen cards on this roadmap, but only 2 of them are actually specifically due by certain dates. And sometimes they might be driven by the market. Like if you are in e-commerce, then it's pretty important to have things out by Christmas time. That's when your big drive is. If you're working in a regulated environment, then it's pretty important to build things in time for legislation. But just because one thing is due by Christmas doesn't mean that everything has to be due by Christmas. And put it in this readable format that everyone can understand what those constraints are and can shuffle things around it and make the adjustments as needed. Another big question that I get is asking about showing dependencies on the roadmap. And I think a lot of the questions around dependencies come from the assumption that a timeline roadmap allows people to show the stacking of projects, like in a Gantt chart sort of way. Like this is what you get when you look up dependencies. This is, I think, what people are looking for. But again, a Gantt chart style format like this is actually much more of a project plan for detailed project planning and isn't useful for communicating strategic long-term plans like a roadmap is meant to do. And you don't have to have this format in order to show dependencies. So very similar to how you showed the hard dates on your roadmap, on a lean roadmap, you can actually still show dependencies as well. So I've got a card that's in my now column that I've bolded and pointed out what it is. I can now point out that a card that's in my later one, just by using a big red flag in there, is dependent on that. And that way I know any human looking at this, anybody working on this roadmap, knows not to shuffle that card from the later column above the one in the now column without looking at and understanding how that's going to affect other things in that roadmap itself. You don't need that sort of stacking, arrow pointing timeline version in order to show dependencies to people. Here's an example in ProdPad. We use a mixture of emoji and images and tags so you can filter down and understand them. This is an individual card that's linked to another card and is using a tag to show that it's been blocked by something else or it's dependent on something else. All right. Well, what about if your boss just expects timelines? Like this is a real question that comes up. And I see a handful of common reasons, and it took me some time to figure out like what those reasons are going to be, but I found 5. So I'm going to go through and talk about those 5 reasons and talk through how to react to each of those. So this is the worst reason I encounter. Control. Sometimes your boss just simply feels like if they give you a timeline roadmap, if they give you dates to work towards, it's going to incentivize you and your team to work faster and work harder and get things out in time. But what they don't know is that this leads to burnout and tech debt. It's an indication of a poor company culture, and it can be hard to push back on. But if you're in this situation, try appealing by talking about the risks. Talk about the risks of accruing tech debt, the risk of losing good developers who are constantly stressed out by these marches towards dates that they can never seem to match, getting stuck building unvalidated features and building the wrong stuff, losing customers in the long run, and ending up with a product that ultimately isn't the right product for the market because you haven't built in time for discovery and understanding, what it is that you actually should be building. So this is the worst reason that I encounter, and can be sometimes the toughest one, but I'm finding that it's increasingly rare because I think nowadays management in companies is changing and realizing that actually discovery is a good element and much more needed. But if you are finding that this is the sole reason, then sometimes it is a matter of looking at the company culture itself. But it is worth finding out if it is one of these other reasons as well, because sometimes it takes a matter of poking around and finding out if it's something like the investors. Like sometimes it's not the boss who wants to see the timeline, but the timeline roadmap becomes this artifact to show off to the investors. Like, it sort of makes sense. If you're investing, I don't know, a few $1,000,000 in a company, you might want to know what you're getting out of it. Except that a smart investor knows that they are investing in a great team. And a great team knows that it's not about what they build, because their first assumptions are going to be wrong anyways. It's about having a good process. A great team knows how to assess problems, propose experiments, and validate solutions until lots of value is created. I mean, if I were an investor, I would ask the team to show me a record of experimentation and understanding of their space. I'd then trust the process to generate a product that would serve that space and hopefully get some profit out of it. An investor isn't looking to buy a laundry list of features. If they were doing that, they would just go buy that laundry list of features from some, bog standard agency somewhere. They should be trusting the team to find that process and build the best thing using the money that they're providing. So if you're finding yourself in this situation, depending on whether you've got access to the investors or not, or whether you're talking to the boss who thinks it's the investors who want the timeline roadmap, talk about the risk that they're putting their investment in, right? Like, this is what they worry about, is their return on investment. Point out how high-performing teams build in discovery first rather than have this delivery mindset. So here's one. I see a lot of tension when I meet people who see themselves as product managers, but their company requires them to be a project manager. I have been there. I have been a product manager by title, but actually a product manager, a project manager by reality. And it happens a lot by accident. I talk to a lot of people who end up in this situation. It often happens because companies take on custom or contractually committed work for a client with an agreed scope and a due date. And then suddenly your roadmap, which could have been full of discovery and experimentation, is rammed with hard due dates. And your business is transformed from a product-led company to basically an agency. Now, there's no shame in making money in an agency model, except that agencies never change the world the way that product companies do. I mean, a company takes on a commitment for each client that it works for, and then a chunk is taken out of potential discovery of new, tastier problems and solutions. If you're delivering projects, if you're delivering projects this way, you need a proper project manager and a project plan. Sadly, though, it's the product manager who inadvertently gets stuck with this role. And so as a result, you end up with a lot of companies who are meaning to be product companies, but are actually siphoning off a lot of the work to act like an agency. And that product manager who thought they were a product manager ends up being the project manager, which can cause a lot of tension and a lot of stress for the product manager. So appeal to your boss's business instincts. Talk about the risk and the downsides of taking on such deals. I mean, it might mean some money in the short term, but it means that you're going to be surpassed by faster moving competitors who are actually doing discovery. I mean, if the business wants to be an agency, if that's the goal, then your bosses need to price hire and plan accordingly. They need to make sure that people in the team understand that they are building like an agency and that the business model is set up that way. But if they want to be a product-led company, then they also need to plan accordingly. And that means leaving room for product to lead. It means leaving room for discovery and for experimentation. And another common reason why a boss wants to see your timeline is not just your boss, it might be your sales manager, your marketing manager, whoever else. They just want to know when something's in the something is in the works, and when something is going to come out. And if they're talking about short term, then it's absolutely a fair question to ask. But they're not asking about the roadmap. They're asking about your release plan. And these are actually two different documents. A product roadmap is a strategic document that outlines your long-term assumptions, whereas your release plan is a completely separate document altogether, and it shouldn't look like your roadmap. Your roadmap should have a completely different audience, a different format, a different place to live. Your release plan lives much closer to where the developers and the actual work is being done day to day, and can have things like short-term due dates, outlines the work that's been agreed upon, work that's been spec'd. It's there to help the team coordinate delivery. It's there to help you understand who's going to be working on what and when things are going to come out. The roadmap in comparison is there to help with discovery and checking assumptions long before you enter any sort of delivery mode. So you can avoid any sort of painful moments by keeping these two documents separate. And as a bonus, one thing I recommend doing is if you've got people like marketing, for example, who are wondering, how to coordinate their launches alongside your product launches, is separate out your hard launches from your soft launches. So for example, you should be able to, at any point in time, release something in a soft launch format, something that's hidden behind a feature flag or something that allows you to test it with a small, safe space. At that point in time, that's when you can start telling marketing that something is ready to start building up their campaigns around, while you're still validating that it's actually, in fact, working with a smaller group of production customers and whatnot. And that way, when they actually do their hard launch, whether that takes them 6 days or 6 months to plan, they then have a complete, ready, approved product to actually sell from. They're actually selling something that exists rather than selling something that they hope exists in time. And it can make a really big difference in terms of taking the stress off of trying to line up a development launch with a marketing launch. And as I said, sometimes you'll have hard dates that you absolutely have to work to. You should be finding out whether these are absolutely necessary, important dates that have to be worked to. Like, are they legal requirements? Are they aligned with the company's desired business model? Are they a distraction into the business model, or are they something that actually makes sense? Are they strategically important for the business? Because I find it really too easy to fall into the trap of becoming more of an agency than a product company. And that happens all too easy if you accept too many arbitrary deadline-driven projects. If you do have the occasional hard date to communicate, you can still ditch your timeline roadmap. Again, the timeline roadmap forces you to show a deadline for everything, whereas if you had a lean roadmap, you could just show dates for the few regulatory things that you have. In some companies, it might make sense based on this field that they're in, that maybe 10% of their items on the roadmap have dates. In other companies, it might be 90%, but that still leaves room for 10% or 80% or whatever percent of the company to be discovery-led. Your execs probably don't care which features are being delivered and when. They just want to know that their teams are putting their best efforts into creating value for the company. A timeline product roadmap has been shown time and time again to be a hindrance in creating value, whereas a lean discovery mindset way of working outperforms every time. So show your boss the outcome you're going for and the value you're going to add and the problems that you intend to solve. And a lean roadmap format can actually do a much better job of that. And if all else fails, it is usually easier to ask for forgiveness than permission. I've coached and helped literally thousands of product people now move from timeline roadmaps to leaner formats. Sometimes it's a matter of just ripping off the Band-Aid and going for it. Sometimes it's a matter of finding like an in-between format that works for your boss, depending on what their appetite is for this. But most people are able to take those steps and move away from the timeline roadmap and find ways to convince their boss that a more discovery mindset is better for their business, and this is how they want to communicate it. Now, that said, I've answered a bunch of questions, and I think I've tackled a lot of the most prominent ones that I've heard. But if you still have questions, then I'm absolutely happy to continue answering them or dive into some of these questions more deeply. We still have a bunch of time here. And I do encourage you to start a trial of ProdPad if you're interested in getting a great template for a lean roadmap. ProdPad both shows you how to do the roadmap itself, as well as gives you a great template that you can use and share and use to get your team on board with a lean roadmap as opposed to the timeline roadmap. And on that note, I'll leave it here so you guys know how to contact me, but feel free to ask me anything. I'll hand it back to Andrea, who can MC some of the questions.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions that have come through. The first is, how would you handle a situation where there's a long marketing cycle and they need a commitment, especially when developing software for example, a medical device, and the device is planned to launch in 2 years?
Okay, really good question. So you're actually talking about medical devices, hardware, and things like that. And a lot of people ask as to whether, like, is this even still valid for you if you're talking about hardware? The thing is that product management for hardware and software products is actually fundamentally the same, except that they operate at different scales and paces. Hardware, particularly if you're talking medical, is naturally slower, and it can't be manipulated and iterated on as quickly as software. I mean, the nature of procurement and manufacturing means that it takes longer. The process of regulations, it means that it's going to take longer. So while the release plan for software might be days or weeks, sometimes the equivalent is many months, or sometimes in medical hardware can be years, because you're having to count on moving parts like shipping components from overseas and lead times on manufacturing. The thing is that that is still considered a release plan, because you're talking about a project that you're not discovering and iterating upon, you're looking to actually deliver. Now, there are ways to do discovery before you move into that process, and now those are things that you can do on your roadmap itself. But in order to pull that off, you do need good project management skills in order to pull off a successful launch, even more so than on a software team due to logistical challenges. Usually a software team can get away with just having like a product owner and a scrum master, and that's all they need. For something of the scale you're talking about, you probably need a much heavier team in terms of the scale, and that's just a reality of it. The flip side of it, though, is that you're in a much more defensible market, as in, no cute little startup is going to start up tomorrow and come beat you in your space, because you're in a much more difficult space to compete in. And it does mean that discovery needs to be done far in advance because your releases are so long. So you still need a lean roadmap, which outlines your obstacles and the problems, which are going to help you articulate your product vision. And that document is still different from your project release plan. So hardware startups, medical startups like that, are more risky and require more upfront investment. It does take longer to experiment and validate assumptions. But it's not to say that continuous discovery is impossible in hardware. There are things that can be done to think about that continuous discovery, and to cut down on that sort of lead cycle. One thing that I actually recommend watching or reading or following up on is Tom Chi's work on, he did work on the Google Glass stuff. He did a talk at Mind the Product in 2012 about rapid prototyping for hardware. Was really interesting and was able to cut tons of work off before they went into something like that. But the same thing still stands. You still need to have a release plan. You still need to separate hard launches from soft launches, even if the cycles are longer and slower.
Thanks for that. There's a lot of really great questions coming through. So I'm
Cool.
going to try to pick a few here.
All right.
The next one is, we are implementing OKRs. I'm wondering how you see OKRs lining up with your roadmap. How often would you review the roadmap?
Cool. I love OKRs. For anybody who's uninitiated, OKRs stands for Objectives and Key Results. Objectives are, and actually I could probably go back here and show you a little bit how these sit within a lean roadmap. One of the pieces that I recommend thinking about when you're talking about objectives and key results is not forgetting the initiatives, because you can't just go straight from objectives to key results. You also need to think about the things that you're going to do, the projects that sort of group together how you're going to do those key results. And those are represented on the roadmap as well. So on your roadmap, you should outline objectives, things that you're going to, basically the high level problems or guardrails for your company. How do you know that how are you measuring success? How do you know that you're moving the right needles? Like in this roadmap, we're saying that we're going to tackle market share and revenue first, and then later on we're going to tackle, user growth and enterprise and things like that. Initiatives are these white cards. Initiatives are problems to be solved or projects or releases or chunks of work that help group together. And key results are usually grouped together, and these are things that you're basically going to say, oh, well, how do we know that we've actually made some movement on this? And key results are usually measured in terms of quantifiable things that are actually done. Now, the thing with OKRs is that they actually do have timelines on them, and they actually work really well with roadmaps. And so what we actually recommend doing is that instead of having a timeline roadmap that says this quarter we're going to deliver this feature, then this feature, then this feature, what you can say is that this quarter we're going to focus our efforts on increasing market share and getting revenue from this type of customer. And your team then has to find out, as many ways as they can. Maybe they'll run 20 experiments or, do X things in order to increase market share and get revenue. And at the end of that quarter, whatever isn't done, That's fine. They move on to the next OKR, but they should have maximized towards that objective. And if you do that each quarter or each cycle of objectives, usually quarterly is pretty common, then you'll find that you're constantly pushing those needles upwards in the right direction. And the key results are helping you, the KRs, key results are helping you measure and make sure that you're actually tracking your results as you go through. So the roadmap can absolutely help you do that. So an example of that is if this company's OKR or a key objective for this quarter was get market share and revenue, you might have a few cards in here saying, okay, well, here's 3 major projects we could do to get market share and revenue, and here's 5, 10, 20 experiments we're going to run, and we're going to see which of these win and which of these don't win at the end of the quarter.
Cool. Next, I'm actually going to combine 2 questions because they're pretty related.
Cool.
The first part is, when you talk about experimentation or discovery work, do you feel that a great company should be able to demonstrate they're doing X amount per week? Or is time irrelevant as far as, experimentation goes? And with that, what are some vanity metrics or possibly non-vanity metrics that you can use to quantify the success or failure of the discovery work that you're doing?
No, really good question. And, at that point in time, I wouldn't necessarily call them vanity metrics. If they're actually measuring something useful, they're just metrics. And that's okay. You should have metrics. I think it's actually really important to measure how you're doing with experimentation. One of the things that I recommend all teams do is take the focus off velocity and user story points and burn down charts and things like that, because that's just how many points you can put out, right? How many points can you build? Which doesn't necessarily mean how well you're actually doing as a team. Instead, I recommend having them measure how many experiments they can run, right? How many experiments can your team run in a quarter or in a month or in a week? You know, if you've got a lot of team members, then it might be a lot. If you've got a few team members, it might just be a few, and that's okay. And it doesn't matter that some of those experiments fail, because even a failure means that you're learning. But measure what kind of work you're putting into the experimentation process, measure that, and learn to get really good at experimenting, because time and time again, we've seen the industry has shown time and time again that companies who are really good at experimenting tend to find better opportunities and are able to maximize on those. The whole nature of experimentation is that you don't know what you're going to find, and that's how you outcompete your competitors, because they don't know either. Right? You're finding the things that your competitors aren't even knowing that they should assume. But as long as you are putting out as many experiments as possible and measuring that, rather than just trying to count as many points as possible, then you're more likely to run into success.
Great. I'm going to combine another two questions because they're pretty related. The first, or what it's about generally, is how to manage stakeholders. So how do you manage stakeholders? What do you do when sales, support, and even your clients are pressuring you to deliver something just so that they can sign up? The teams that are very, you know, build feature X because we know it's what we need.
Right.
How do you change that language to actually problem solving?
Okay, I mean, this could be an entire other webinar. I
This is very true.
I deliberated as to whether to add this question as well. Like, what about when not my boss, but my salesperson or my customer asks? And it's a really good question.
No webinar on that, Janna.
No, I've got the answer. So if your customer is asking for it, understand as to whether this is something that is this something that your company buys into? Like, you know, has your company sold, you know, a month of time to them? If so, congratulations, you're an agency. You're basically just selling your time to this particular company in order to deliver something to them, which takes you back in that whole thing of pushing back on your boss and figuring out whether you're a product company or an agency. One thing I've learned is that one extra feature that customer says, oh, well, I'll buy when you have this, rarely ever works. It's never that one extra feature. It's always that one extra feature plus one extra feature plus one extra feature. I always recommend to people to take a look at the product they have and understand how to better sell the product they have. You almost certainly have something that adds value to somebody, and it's a matter of finding the right customers for that product, and then using discovery to understand what kind of potential problems you might have and solving those problems at the pace that makes sense for you, right? If it means that sometimes you have to say no to a customer because you're not able to deliver it fast enough for their whatever timeline, it means that you're actually saying no to them, but yes to a much bigger opportunity, which is discovering much better opportunities that are out there. And those are the companies that don't fall into that agency black hole. If it's your salespeople, this is a really tough one. If it's your salespeople, they have to understand that their job is to sell the product that you have, right? If they can't sell the product that you have, either your product is unsellable, which is one problem, or you've got bad salespeople. If you've got bad salespeople, get rid of them. That's it, right? Like, just don't have those salespeople. Find people who can sell the product that you have. I know that's not always in your control, which is a tough answer to give, but salespeople should not be selling stuff that they don't have. If they are unable to sell the product and there is actually, you know, this need for further improvements to the product before they can actually viably sell it, okay, fine, but redeploy them as researchers, right? Use them to help you understand and do the discovery work, not to sell people on future, you know, you're promising to have X by this date, but help them or have them help you validate what kind of things might go onto your future roadmap. Because your roadmap is basically, at the end of the day, a way of validating what kind of future problems you're going to solve. And as long as you don't have dates on there, you can still show it to people saying, hey, well, this is where we think we're going. Is this more or less the type of thing that you would buy? And if you start finding that your future roadmap is resonating with people and your current product is completely unsellable, at least you have some good direction as to where to go, and that salesperson can help you get there. And then once you actually have something sellable, then that salesperson can actually sell what you have. The problem comes is when the salesperson is selling things that you don't have. That is called an agency, again, because they're selling your time for money, and that's a trap that a lot of companies get stuck into.
Cool. We have another question. I realized my boss doesn't actually want a roadmap, but rather a project plan to deliver an MVP. How do I create, if possible, a lean project plan with updates?
A project plan for an MVP. Well, an MVP is, I mean, assuming you're starting from a greenfield thing, an MVP is really like the easy part, and you're talking about something really short term. I mean, start by doing some early discovery work. Start with a clipboard, start with some pieces of paper and understanding what kind of problems you might be able to solve for your customers. Start by understanding the problem first. You probably still need some sort of version of a roadmap. It just might not be that, now, next, later in a more mature company might mean, 5 years worth of work. In your company, it might represent, 5 months worth of work. And that's totally okay, because your vision isn't so big that it needs a massive roadmap. Your delivery release plan is still going to be super short, at which point, if you're building an MVP, I mean, do you even need a release plan per se, or do you just simply need like a simple Kanban Trello board that you work with the developer next to you? I wouldn't overcomplicate it with having like a complicated release plan of some sort. Most teams just have like a list of, okay, we think this is important to build, and then this is important to build. Let's try this one thing. If that doesn't stick and that feature doesn't work for anybody, let's kill that and prototype the next thing. And if that works, then we'll continue building on that. The thing with an MVP is try not to over bloat it. A lot of people think that they need a lot of features in MVP, when in reality, more often than not, you should be thinking about what's the minimum that you actually need to make it actually viably work for your customers.
Thank you. Here's a good one. Which time period are you referring to when you talk about now?
Right. Okay. So we talk about now, next, and later. The whole point of these is that they are flexible, depending on the context of the company and the product. So for some companies, if you're a micro startup, now, next, later, as in its whole, might actually mean 6 months worth of work. For a much more mature company, it might represent a lot more work, because as the company grows, its horizon vision sort of grows with it. Let's say you're talking about a mid-sized company, now might represent 3 months of work, next might mean 3 to 9 months, later might mean 9 to 18 months, right? Something like that. But that your results may vary, and frankly, it doesn't really matter, because you don't even know how big you're going to be in 12 months time, let alone how fast you're able to deliver. It's more about making sure that you're solving the problems in the right order. What I usually recommend with now is that it represents the problems that you are currently solving. And that can mean everything from initial discovery through to final validation, as well as all the development work in between. So a card might live in your now column literally 4 months, and that's okay. You're not looking for something that's moving around for a lot. Your release plan will move a lot because you're constantly releasing. You should be doing releases, a couple times a week or as often as possible, whereas your roadmap is still basically saying, here's where we are now, and here's the problems that we think are important to us now. That's what we're working on right now. Here's what we think are the big problems coming up next, and here's the big problems we think that are going to come at us later on in the future. If you're familiar with the cone of uncertainty, it's a graph that sort of points out, the way that I like to think about it is like you're standing in one place. The things that are right in front of you are the things that you can see quite clearly. That's your now. The things that are beyond that are your next, and they're sort of like just out of reach. And the later is sort of like that fuzzy stuff on the horizon. Now, how far away the horizon is or how far away the next is sort of depends on, how tall you're standing on, what kind of platform you're standing on, therefore how mature your product is and how big your team is.
We still have a couple questions, Janna, if you have time
Excellent.
to answer them.
Keep them
Keep
coming. I'm
going.
happy to keep chatting. Yep.
All right. The next one is, who is typically responsible for the release plan?
Good question. So it depends on the nature of your business. The thing with a release plan, a project plan, or something like that, totally depends on whether you are, hyper agile or you're waterfall or you're something in between. For companies who are agile, you'll often have like a scrum master and a product owner who manage your release plan. Oftentimes your release plan is actually like a Kanban board in Trello. Sometimes it's a board in Jira. Release plans take all sorts of different forms, just like agile and development takes all different forms. Usually it's owned by the development team though, because they're the ones who are actually managing the releases. The product manager doesn't own it because frankly they are not the ones who are deciding everything that's happening. They don't have oversight of everything that's happening in engineering, in development. They can sort of say, here are the big problems we want you to work on, right? That's your roadmap. They can give guidance on what kind of experiments they want to give, but the developers still need to carve out time to say, well, we're going to spend some time maintaining. We're going to spend some time, doing paying down tech debt. We're going to spend some time doing other stuff that doesn't sort of fit with the roadmap or everything else. And somebody in the tech team is going to be deciding as to, who's on holiday this week, who has, the ability to work on this particular project, who has time to do this. And it's really done in that sort of nitty gritty. And so it's not really the product manager's job to point and say, this is where things are, this is when everything's going to be out. It should be left to the project development project person to decide how that all happens. So you give them the autonomy to do so, and trust that they'll be picking up on the roadmap and working through the experiments that you put on it as fast as they can. And putting them out the other side, hopefully, in at least 2 weekly releases or something like that.
Cool. We have two more questions here set up. The first is, when we are asked for dates to help the business coordinate their activities, what is a good way to position this on the roadmap? We are in definition period for first release and are planning to do some plus or minus 50% estimation at the epic level to help.
Okay. I might need to know a little bit more about that one, but my gut feel with that one is that you've got the rest of the business, so probably like the business facing marketing and sales and basically the people who are interfacing with the customers and with other areas of the business, deciding as to how they do their activities based on the product manager's activities. What I recommend doing is keeping as much transparency as possible, making your roadmap visible to them, and keeping them posted on more or less the progress that's being made. And so if you're working on something now, they more or less know what kind of things are keeping you busy now. But when it comes to actual releases, separate that hard launch from the soft launch. And so if somebody's saying, hey, I can't start that billboard campaign until I know when this is going to be live. When is this going to be live? Don't take that bait. Don't agree to that, because chances are you might say, okay, it's going to be live in 1 month's time. And turns out if you take 6 weeks to do that, you've ended up with a half-done product, or you've collected tech debt and stressed out your developers to get something out in time, or you've simply missed that deadline and you've given the business side commitments that you couldn't stick to. Instead, if they're trying to build something that's mission critical off that, make sure that you can actually complete that mission first. And with software, because it's more of an art than a science, finish your mission first. Like point out, like sell what we have. Here's the features that we did launch. Here's what we launched last quarter. Go start a campaign on that. Make sure you've sold those things and done all the work that you can on the existing product. As for what's coming out, we'll tell you as soon as we've got something that is like ready to be turned on and marketed. But we're not going to give you commitments that you can try to hang an expensive, risky business decision on, because we can't be held to that either. You don't know that some developer's not going to take some sick holiday time off, or sick time off, or no one's going to book a last minute holiday, or something's going to go wrong with the tech, because it always does. And it's impossible to hold up those commitments.
We have a ProdPad related question, and I think it gives us an opportunity to possibly show off the charts if you perhaps want to start bringing that up. And the question is, in the lean model, what's the best way to manage idea prioritization across multiple products in ProdPad?
So in the what, sorry?
Lean model. So if
Yeah.
you're lean, what's the best way to manage idea prioritization?
Yep.
That's a tough word to say at 5 p.m. on a Tuesday. Across multiple products in ProdPad.
Okay. So prioritization is a really interesting one, because it's at the end of the day, that is the core job of the product manager, is to help make decisions on what kind of things happen next. The roadmap helps you prioritize from the top down, right? It allows you to say, these are our objectives, right? We want to get market share first, and revenue, and we want to move into onboarding and then later engagement and that sort of stuff. And these are the problems we want to tackle along the way. But you can't just work from the top down, because it means that you're not paying attention to the market itself. A good product manager would also be listening to the opportunities that are happening in the market. And that includes listening to customers, listening to ideas coming in from the team, and understanding, the relative impact and effort of ideas, and which one of these are going to make a difference to your customers. Like, for example, in ProdPad, you can do things like, since I've got a revenue card here, I might go into my ProdPad and say, show me all the ideas in ProdPad that are revenue generating, useful for the type of customers who use Apartment Tracker, this particular product, and are quick wins and not yet on the roadmap. And you can filter down, find those matching ideas, and then decide which of those actually deserve to go on the roadmap. Now, nowhere in there do we attempt to write you an algorithm that magically tells you this is the #1 idea, because there is no magic algorithm. There is no silver bullet to prioritization. Prioritization still takes a human to understand what the big problems are, what the objectives are for the company, and what kind of opportunities exist. But the point of a roadmap is that it helps you see those problems and see what those opportunities are, what those solutions are that you're laying out against it, and make sure that you're actually making those decisions and asking the right questions. You then are able to choose those ideas, put them on your roadmap, and see them at the individual product level, at the product line level, or at the portfolio level, and make your prioritization decisions at each of those levels. If anybody would like a more detailed view of that, reach out to us. Go to prodpad.com/demo, or reach out to us through the app or through any way possible. And we'd be happy to set up a one-on-one demo and show you exactly how that works.
And we have one last question, I say, before anyone actually starts typing anything else. But the last question of the day, at least for now, is do you think there is a way to co-develop a product or feature with a client without falling into the agency trap?
Yes. As long as it depends on how you define agency. I mean, and it depends on how you're actually working with that client. I mean, if that client understands that you are working with them in a cooperative way, you are co-developing it with them, you can actually say that you're not charging them for the end result, but you're going to work with them to solve their problems. A lot of product design agencies or product agencies nowadays will actually say, you have this problem and this problem and this problem, and we're going to help you run these type of experiments and these type of experiments in order to discover and understand and solve those problems. And we'll do that over the course of the next 6 months. And we're going to charge you whatever grand per month. At the end of the 6 months, they've made, you know, the thousands that they've charged for, but they weren't charged for, they weren't charged based on the delivery of specific features. They were charged for the process, which is very similar to being measured on the experiments that you're putting out rather than the output that you're doing. So it is possible. You can also do occasional work for clients without falling into that agency trap. I mean, doing it occasionally for one client is not going to mean that your company is doomed and you are forever project manager. It just means that you have done a trade-off. You've traded off whatever, whether it's a month or weeks or whatever amount of time it was, to not do discovery for that time, which is a risk. Like maybe somebody in your competitive field moved a little bit faster than you for that time, but chances are it hasn't doomed you. It's not the end of the world, and you can get back out of that agency trap. It's not a trap yet, you know, it's just it's a dip, and you can get back into being product led, and you've got some more cash in your pocket for it. So it's not the end of the world, and it is possible to co-develop truly with the client, if they do know the sort of terms of how you work and you're not working to delivery dates and paid for deliverables in that same way.
Cool, thank you. I think with that, I was going to say with that we're done, but we just got one last minute question. Do you have time, Janna, for one last?
Yeah, we can answer one more.
Cool. What about the idea of productizing a project? I'm not sure what that means, Steve, if you like, as I'm reading it, I'm like, what?
Productizing a project. I think I know what you mean. Like sometimes this works. Like you work with a client and the client says, hey, I'd really like you to build this thing. You know, we'll pay you £100,000 to have it. Sorry, just use pounds. Let's use dollars. $100,000 to have it done at the end of 6 months. And you can sometimes, if you are lucky and smart and everything works out really nicely, turn that into something that you can resell to the next customer. It doesn't always work. I've worked for companies who made that assumption and turns out they were wrong, and it kind of tanked the company because they made too many big assumptions like that and sold too much of their time off that way. I've worked for other companies that actually employed it really well. And so I think it's a matter of just understanding, like, you know, is this project strategically aligned with what the company is trying to do? Is it small enough and, you know, if you mitigated the risk enough that you can risk doing it? Are you betting everything on that one project? Is it something that, you know, if needed, if it doesn't work, you can still step away from and, you know, spend the rest of your time on discovery? So it is possible, but it does introduce an element of risk in its own sense. That said, discovery itself introduces an element of its own risk because you don't know what you're going to discover. So it's a matter of figuring out what your company's risk appetite is and, you know, operating that way. I hope that helps, and I hope that answered the question based on what we got there.
Steve is saying yes, thank you.
Wonderful, cool, thank you very much.
With that, we have officially gone over the hour. It's the first time we have done a webinar that's gone over a full hour. So thank you guys so much for all of your questions. Thank you, Janna, for being here today and giving us this webinar. Yeah, you do have plenty of stories to share, absolutely. I mean, we can keep on talking, it's fine, but I think you guys have to actually get back to work. So we will be sending out the recording over the next couple of days. If you want to watch it again and share this with your team, please do so. And if you have any questions, you can always email hello@prodpad.com, or you can go to prodpad.com/demo. We have a cute little video there, very helpful benefits video. You can book some time with us, or you can always tweet at ProdPad, and we'll be happy to help you out. Thank you, everyone.
Wonderful. Thanks, everyone. And thank you, Andrea, for emceeing.
Anytime.
Take care and talk to you all again next time. Bye.
Bye.